Hi, everybody. I am a philosophy professor and I teach a lot of different classes, and one of the ones I teach is a course in ethical theory. And so the standard kind of stuff you might teach in there would be you probably maybe heard of utilitarianism, um, Kant's ethical theory of there's always a right thing to do and the consequences don't matter, and utilitarianism, the consequences are what matters. Aristotle's virtue ethics, this kind of stuff. Standard stuff. I came across some research recently. I like the fact that people are doing sort of more empirical research in philosophy because sometimes you can answer questions with data and stuff, and we should do that. Um, and there was a study about the idea was people who are experts in fields are much better at those fields than people who are not experts because of their training and their experience, right? And so who are the experts in ethics? Well, ethics professors who study ethics and teach ethics, not any philosophy professor, but someone who teaches it regularly, like I do. And so what they decided to do with with these tests were to get a group of philosophy professors who regularly teach ethics and a group of everyday people and give them the same test and see can we test to see who's more ethical. And their test of more ethical was what are your actual ethical values, and then do you actually live up to them? And in terms of the actual ethical values, they found that ethics professors were clearly more ethical in terms of both being able to clearly articulate their values and how stringent their values were. For example, they were much more likely to say that when prompted, yes, you should donate part of your salary to charity. Yes, you should not eat the flesh of sentient animals. Yes, you should call your mother every so often. And they had I forget what the time thing was. So they were clearly more ethical in being able to articulate what their values were and having more stringent values. But they found that when they asked them, how often do you call your mother and do you eat the flesh of animals and do you donate to charity, they were no more likely to do that than the regular people that weren't ethics professors. So the conclusion, either implicitly drawn or explicitly drawn, was studying ethics doesn't make our ethics professors aren't more moral than regular people, and therefore studying ethics doesn't make you any more moral. I can see how people would think that, but I already kind of chuckled at that and go, well, of course not. Because I was trained in philosophy in the notion that in Eastern and Western philosophy, it was always about how you transform yourself. The idea was to transform yourself, not just to be ethical in the sense of right and wrong, but to be a better person in terms of your mental and emotional states. And so in ethics, all we do is study the theory and teach the theory. We don't actually do anything. And so I started transforming my class by inserting a set of actual practices that also helped the students understand the techniques, but also got them practicing them and talking about them in class. And so I'm going to share my screen here, and the rest of my talk is just showing you some examples of that. And this has really transformed my classroom. Not only cognitively, the students tend to get um, the stuff better, but we talk about the stuff in class. So here's an example of, on the left here, we just list all the different techniques in the ethics class, and I'm going to show you a couple of these examples. So these are various techniques, and of course you may not know what any or some of these are. On the right, you see some basic questions like, give us an example of how you applied this technique. So first we study the theory just like you would in any class, and then when we get to an actual technique, whether it's explicit or implicit in the course, I make this sort of this technique slide as part of the reading. I say I expect you to actually reflect back on your life in terms of how well does this apply to understanding yourself, others, and society. And then actually try to do the practice in something in the future. And so how helpful has this been to you? Stuff like this. So here's an example of part of their reading. And this is Aristotle's table of virtues and vices and virtue ethics. And so the virtue is the mean down the middle. And if you don't have the virtue, you have one or both of the vices, too much or too little. And so courage is the virtue of facing danger, whether it's physical or social danger. Rashness is the excess of going too far, facing danger you shouldn't, rushing in against, five guys with guns when you're unarmed. Cowardice, of course, self-explanatory. And so I asked them to plot themselves, which of these virtues do you have? And if you don't have the virtue, do you have one or both of the vices? And then I asked them also to ask your parents or someone who knows you really well, where would they plot you, right? And then I say, okay, think about in your life, is there any virtue that you don't have that if you had it, your life wouldn't go better? And is there any vice that if you do have, if you got rid of it, your life wouldn't go better? And I always have them say, so this gets into like, this is really important. And I ask them, of course, how much of this determines how well your life goes. That's always at least 70% for them. So I'm saying, okay, you ought to be working on this. So then I give them a slide I don't have here, which is, okay, how to practice this stuff. And so we talk about this stuff and they come back in class and they're giving me examples in class, and they're hearing it from their fellow students, and they're asking us for help, like, okay, how, and I ask them, okay, for every one of you, I know that you have a virtue that you didn't have that you've actually worked on and got. They all agree. And you all have a vice that you used to have that you got rid of that you worked on, and they all agree. And I say, okay, that means you know how to develop a virtue and you know how to get rid of a vice, replicate that process in wherever else you want to improve. And then we have conversations not about just the text, which we've done for a couple of weeks, but how does this actually apply to our lives? How we view others? How important is this? How do you do this? And we're all learning from each other. Um, there's another technique that we do. This is so Kant is a famous moral ethicist, and he has a theory called categorical ethics, which means there's always a right and wrong, regardless of the consequences. And the easiest version of this, he has different versions, is a so-called ends imperative. And this is basically testing it's if you want to know whether what you want to do is immoral or not, ask yourself, am I ever treating a human being as merely a means to an end and not an end? If I'm treating them as merely a means to an end, they're just an object, right? And so this tests for that. And so it tests for whether we're treating other people, ourselves included, as merely objects, as merely instrumental value. And so this is the actual technique slide. So it reminds them this is Kant's categorical imperative. It quotes him here on it. On the right, it gives them a little reminder of the theory, tests for whether we're treating others as ourselves as merely objects with instrumental value only, rather than as beings with intrinsic value. It does so by testing whether we treat others as ourselves as merely a means to an end. You are a means to an end to me here, but if that's all you are, that's a problem. To use someone as a mere means is to involve them in a schema of action to which they could not in principle consent, perhaps due to force, coercion, or deceit, right? Treating someone as merely a means to an end is literally dehumanizing. It reduces them to merely an object. So that's sort of a summary of the theory, and then we get the practice. Here's an example. It always starts out with two parts. Observe non-judgmentally, right? You're like a third-person scientist, then actually try and do it. So in what circumstances do you or your society engage in Kantian ends imperative-like moral reasoning, right? How is this played out? Explicitly, do you actually apply the moral categorical imperative? Have you learned this like from your parents or a class? Or since you've learned it in this class, do you actually apply it? Give me an example. Probably not, but implicitly, do you find yourself guided by universal principles such as it's wrong to use others against their will, including deception? Where do you see this playing out? How have your parents taught you like this kind of stuff? Where's this come up in your consciousness of judging someone else as good or bad yourself? Reflect on cases where you or your society decided based on the above to condemn or end a practice or change behavior. So this gets them thinking about economic and political and legal issues. And I have a bank of examples to give them, but I want them to come up with their own. Reflect on cases where you or your society have violated the ends imperative individually, socially, politically. And how do you judge that? How does your society judge that? Try it out. Use the ends imperative reasoning to decide courses of action. How comfortable does it feel? How useful is it? How do you feel about the outcome it prescribes? And I ask them to report their experiences in class. And I always have one or two every class that reports on one of these things. I had one student, for example, on this one, I thought he was joking, and I thought the class thought he was joking. He said, well, I've been having this sexual relationship with this girl, and I realized, I didn't think anything was wrong with it, but I realized I'm just using her for sex. That's all I care about. I'm using her as merely an object. And we thought he was making a juvenile joke, like he was, but I realized, oh no, he's serious. He's had a moral epiphany because of this. And he's like, so I said, so what did you do? He goes, I talked to her and I ended the relationship because I thought, I don't want to treat you like an object. And it was because of this that I started thinking that way. And I thought that was just incredible because you could see in him that he'd had this moral sort of awakening. And then I walked in, Kant can actually be wrong. He can be right about this and wrong. Kant thought you shouldn't have sex unless you were married because there's no way you could have sex with someone and not use them like an object unless you were married. And he has a complicated reasoning for that. And I said, but Kant could be wrong, right? We know people that are in married relationships that treat each other like objects and people who are not that treat each other like ends. And so it's possible that it's great that you reflected, but if you go back and reflect, as long as your partner knows what's going on and you agree to it, right? And you can enjoy them as an object, as a means to an end, as long as that's not all you, as long as they're always someone who's worthy of respect, regardless of that in your eyes, you haven't done something wrong, right? Kant wouldn't agree with this, but a lot of modern people would say he should agree with that. And so then you go, oh, so I might, as long as it's done in a certain way, right? And so this got into a great conversation with the students. So again, I've developed about 12 of these techniques, a couple from Aristotle's virtue ethics, a couple from Kant's ethics, one on utilitarian thinking. I sometimes teach in that class because I want to see them where those kind of theories are more like ethics is how to understand what right and wrong are. Virtue ethics is how to understand what good and bad character are, what kind of people you should be. And then I end with Stoicism because Stoicism is really about how to control your mental and emotional states, not just how to be good and bad. So that you can, that's also part of ethics because ethics in the wider sense is the good life. And we go through about a dozen techniques in that course. And I try to get most of the talking of the course about those techniques. I tell them, once you understand the theory, that's really what this is about, right? Because it's like it doesn't matter if you're in the parking lot and you see the wallet and you pick it up and it's got the money and the ID. If you don't turn the wallet in, you know you should turn it in. We all know that, but how often do we actually do it, right? And so this is about how to transform yourself to actually be more ethical. You got to take up a set of practices, and taking up these techniques is the practice. I have not been timing myself. How am I doing, Warner?
You're doing pretty good. It's 9:58. You got 3 or 4 more minutes because we
Okay.
did late.
Well, let me stop there and see if you've got a couple of questions. And I could, if we have more time, answer more questions or go through more of the slides, more of the techniques. What would you prefer? Oh, what's the result of this? I get more. I've
Yeah.
seen my attendance go up in class. I've seen the quality of the discussion go up, more people coming in to the discussion because of this. And I'm able to draw them in, even you always want to draw people in that don't want to talk. And so it's easier to draw them into this because it connects with their life and they see the value of it. And I ask them, I prime them with, you've thought this way before, right? Your parents have taught you this way before. You've looked at the world this way before. And they always say yes. And now they can't say, no, I have nothing to say about this, right? And so now it's like, well, you said, so now give me an example. Oh, I can't think of anything right now, Dr. Heise. Okay, we'll come back to you in about 5 minutes. Start thinking, right? Break them up into groups or stuff like this. So it brings it more alive for them. It makes it more concrete. It shows them the value of philosophy is not just about theory, it's about how you live. And it really does get to the most important things in their lives. And it teaches them a set of techniques for how to think about moral issues so that they can find right answers, but also gets them doing that so that they're more moral. And I give them the example for me. I always used to stop and help people when they break down on the side of the road because I used to not know how to work on a car and now I do, and now I give back. But after teaching Kant's idea that you have to help other people, I now find myself doing it more often. I'll sometimes drive past someone and realize, wait a minute, I haven't stopped, so I got to go back. Kant will stick in my head. It makes me do the thing I was already doing more often. I'll stop when I walk by the homeless person at the grocery store and sometimes go, wait a minute, I haven't engaged with them in a while, whether it's giving them money or buying them food or just talking to them. It's been too long. So I'll do it myself, but Kant makes me think of this technique to do it more often. So I give them those examples and I draw these examples out of them. And so I don't know if it's making them more moral because I can't go back and test that, but it seems like it's making, well, actually, I've seen examples of that in class like that one student. I've seen the sort of moral awakening in the way they discuss these things in their body language. So.